Hey everybody, and welcome to chapter number 10. We're talking about psycholinguistics, and I know that sounds like a really interesting subject area, right? Because it's got the word psycho in it. But no, this is not like dangerous, threatening linguistics. This is not, antisocial linguistics. This is just language. And we're looking at language specifically, the word the psycho comes in, because we're talking about it through the prism of psychology. And you'll notice that I don't start every chapter that way by making that clear, but the reason why I am for this chapter is because language has been studied through lots and lots of different lenses throughout education and throughout research, not just within the field of education, but also within the fields of biology and also the fields of communications and also linguistics. Linguistics is its own field of study that we're going to be kind of looking through as we move. But let's do it. So we're just talking about language mostly in this chapter. So we're going to be talking about where language takes place in the brain, what the basic rules are of language, how we acquire language, and whether or not language changes the way that we perceive the world. And finally, we'll be talking about whether or not language is specific to humans. So we got a lot of stuff to cover. I'm going to run through a lot of this. You'll notice that I have a lot of videos here, and that's because partly I just find this stuff really interesting, and I love seeing videos of language-based psychological phenomenon. We're going to be looking at a lot of these, but I'm going to shout out a couple that we're not going to be covering in this video. Specifically, the Project NIM trailer. We're going to be talking about this at the very, very end, so I just want to spotlight it here. This is a documentary that came out, it had to be more than 10 years ago. It came out a while ago. But it is about a group of researchers who try to train a chimpanzee to speak sign language. And they very specifically do this by raising the chimp as an adult, or as a child. They raise it as a human being. So it happened in, I think, the 60s and 70s. So really cool, really sad movie, but you can watch the trailer there. We're going to be talking about NIM a little bit later. And that goes the same for Alex the Parrot as well. I write a little bit about Alex the Parrot in our textbook. We're not going to be talking about him too much, but very, very cool, very, very compelling evidence for parrots and language learning. And then finally, for polyglots, for people that know a lot of different languages, it always kind of blows my mind whenever somebody knows more than 2 languages. And so this video is kind of like is talking with somebody who knows, I think, like 16 different languages or something like that. So really kind of interesting to look through. So let's get into it. We're talking about the brain now. So we're starting here by talking about where language occurs in the brain. And as you may have guessed, a lot of that is going to be in the left hemisphere. And we talked about this a little bit back in chapter 2 when we were talking about split brain research. You may remember that because we were talking about how the left hemisphere is the one that's more language-based, and then the one that's more kind of computationally driven is over on the right. And this is usually really, really kind of oversimplified and dumbed down to be language is on the left, math is on the right, or whatever. And so sometimes I don't see it as much as I used to, but in the classroom I would have people, and no offense to people who have done this before, but I usually have people who say like, well, I'm more of a left brain learner, and so I need the lecture slides ahead of time or whatever. And there's very good reasons why maybe you should have the lecture slides ahead of time, but being a left brain learner is not really a thing. There's not really any kind of good, compelling research to show this. And if you want to call me on this, let's go for it, dude, because usually once a semester somebody will challenge me on this, and I always have to be like, I know this is an extremely common thing that people talk about in the world. It is not a thing. Now, I will say, though, that doesn't mean that some people are better at learning written versus visual. That's not what I mean at all. So if you ever hear somebody say they're a left brain learner or a right brain learner, they're either oversimplifying things or they don't know what they're talking about. So think about that next time you use that language. Do you want somebody to think that you're either oversimplifying or that you don't understand it? All right, so we use both hemispheres while we talk, which is why, as I said, is an oversimplification to say that it's just one hemisphere. But the left side is going to be more active for language compared to the right side. And this is not just for when we are talking language, but also for when we are thinking in language. So if you are thinking to yourself and you got that phonological loop, that little voice in your head, that is going to show up as activation in your left hemisphere, even if you aren't actually creating the language. And we know this because we have seen what happens whenever people have brain damage and they have lesions, a neurological lesion in their left hemisphere, that it often results in problems with language. And you may even know people in your own life that have had a stroke, for example. That's a very common thing that happens whenever somebody has a stroke, especially in their left hemisphere. It may disrupt their ability to form language for a while, or maybe ever, depending on how severe the stroke is. So let's key in on a couple of specific areas. I want to talk primarily about Broca's area and about Wernicke's area. So Broca's area is going to be the area that is associated with speech production. Because if this area is damaged, what happens is that people have problems with speech production. I will show you a video of what that looks like in just a moment. But the key here is that for Broca's aphasia, whenever this specific part of the brain is damaged, Broca's area is damaged, and it creates Broca's aphasia, that those individuals are able to speak, but their speech is halting, it is very slow, and you'll see it. The reason why I highlight that is to contrast that with Wernicke's aphasia. So if this area, Wernicke's area, is damaged, is almost the exact opposite, where there is no issue producing speech, but the speech that comes out doesn't really have a comprehensible, clear, obvious meaning to it. So you can see, for example, right here, Broca's area, the spot in kind of the frontal temporal lobe, it's actually kind of straddling both the parietal, the frontal, and the temporal. But this is going to be the area that's going to be really in charge of helping us produce language. We know what it does in part, as I mentioned, because of lesions, and here is the brain of a extremely influential patient whose name was Tan. Actually, no, I might take this back. I'm going to hold off on elaborating because I might be wrong about this. But I think this might be Tan's brain. It might be another one of his patients, but either way. You can see here the clear damage in that part of the brain, which would render this individual with some serious communication problems. So I'm going to show you an individual. This is Sarah Scott. She has what's sometimes called expressive aphasia. I call it Broca's aphasia just because I might be old school now. That was just the way that I learned, is that it was always called Broca's aphasia. But you hear it sometimes called now, you hear it called expressive aphasia, but that's what this is. So we're going to check in with her. She was, I want to say, a high school senior whenever she had a stroke.
Linear binaural mod devices uses dual-mode stimulation to soothe tinnitus. Linear combines sound stimulation and multi-pattern tongue pulses to...
I think I might have gotten some pseudoscience targeting me. I don't think that was real science that we were just seeing in the advertisement. All right, here we go.
Okay. So what's your name?
Scott. Oh, no. Sarah Scott.
That's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
I can't.
Oh. You're 19. 19.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what happened to you?
Stroke.
You had a stroke last year.
Yes.
And what happened? Can you remember what happened?
School and English class.
Okay.
And I book and I read it aloud. But I can't because stroke. And so I turn and also it's the same as the same kind of thing as you know
Pins and needles.
Yeah,
like pins
the
and
same, and also arm as well.
Leg.
Leg. Yeah.
Okay, all right, so you got it. I just played 90 seconds of this. Sarah Scott has released a lot of videos that you can check out if you want to follow her on YouTube. But hopefully you saw a little bit of the symptomology that I was talking about here, where she was clearly lucid, right? So she was answering the questions appropriately, like they made sense. But the issue was that it was clear that she was having some issue getting that communication out, of producing that speech. If we were to look at her handwriting, I know you may have noticed that she was writing something down. Handwriting is usually also going to be affected by this, so it's not just the case where she can write totally fine, because language is not just spoken, it's also written. That would also impair her ability to write. Now, the reason why I showed you this video specifically is because I've shown this video maybe since the very first cognitive psychology class I ever taught, when I was talking about language. And the thing that I love about Sarah's videos is that she usually updates once a year. And so let's check in with 15 years later.
Yeah.
How's she doing?
Zaran Mamdani ran for state assembly promising to
Okay, come
defund the
on.
police.
Why am
With
I getting
Mamdani,
political ads
fewer
here?
cops on the streets and in subways.
I think that's crazy.
Cuomo will
That's
add
so
police
annoying.
and expand after-school programs, paid for by Fix the City.
Hello, this is Sarah. 15 years ago, I had my stroke. Wow, that is a long time ago. I think I say that every year now, but it is a long time. I've got a few things to update you. I think it's going to be kind of a short video this time, but still very exciting, I think. One of the things, it was our anniversary, our wedding anniversary last month. We had dinner at a pub. It was actually our first date, so that's why we went there, but it was really nice. So yeah. Next thing is we're actually moving. Not far away really, it's actually nearer to my work.
Okay, I'm just going to pause there because you can see here that the symptoms are maybe still there a little bit, but for the most part completely gone. Now, I want to address that for a couple of reasons. One is because we see how this changes, that it's not fixed, it's not static, where she had this brain injury when she was 19, and then now, 15 years later, I mean, to be honest, I don't know if I would have ever guessed that there was an issue here. We do see some pauses. We do see maybe some moments of her saying and things like that. But hey, I do the exact same thing, and most people who are recording YouTube videos when they're looking right at the camera do the same thing too. So I'm not going to call her out on that. But if you want to, you can check out, like I said, her YouTube video. She usually once a year will record something to show progress, and you can see 2 or 3 years after her stroke, she had some serious problems communicating, but they get better and better each year. I can't remember if I already mentioned that she's an elementary school teacher. She mentioned her work. She became a school teacher, which I feel like is really nice and fun. What else do I want to say? Oh, the other thing is that this is a great recovery. This is an awesome recovery. And in part, it is partially because she was so young whenever she had her stroke. At that early age, lots and lots of neuroplasticity, which is going to allow the brain to heal itself a little bit faster than it would for most folks my age, for example. All right. Okay, so now let's move over to fluent aphasia, which is sometimes called Wernicke's aphasia. Why is it Vern instead of Wern? It is because it is German, my friend. That is why the V is pronounced like a W, or the W is pronounced like a V. So let's check in with Byron. The thing about him is, remember, he's got the opposite now. So what you can expect is that actually, you watch it and you tell me.
Hi Byron, how are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck, for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. And with happening, I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was very good. And happy when I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We save a lot of hands on hold for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talk of any more to saying?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope the world lasts for you.
Thank you.
All right, what a great sentiment, right? That he says that instead of saying goodbye or whatever, he just says, or I hope you have a good day. I hope the world lasts for you. That's such a nice sentiment. So this is, as I mentioned, this is Brian. He is on a cruise for stroke survivors and people in recovery. And you can see here that essentially he has the opposite problem that Sarah did whenever she was 19. That she had a lot of difficulty getting words out. He has no problem getting words out. The issue is, if you try to follow his train of thought, it's very, very cluttered. It's very, very messy. It's very hard for us to follow exactly what he's saying whenever he's answering these questions, which whenever you watch him, there's only a few moments of confusion, right? But for the most part, he looks like it's very clear that he knows what he's talking about. But when it comes out, it doesn't seem to register as meaningful in the way that we normally do. So we would say that for him, for Brian, that he has issues with semantics. So no issues with the production of speech, but lots and lots of issues with actually getting it to be meaningful, to be comprehensible in the normal kind of rules of syntax that we know of. All right. As we mentioned, we got Broca's area around here, we got Wernicke's area around here, mostly concentrated in the left hemisphere, but not always. So let's take a look. So before we move on, I want to talk a little bit more about this distinction of left hemisphere versus right hemisphere. There are a couple of exceptions for people that have language predominantly in left hemisphere. And I would say there are kind of two categories of that. One is left-handed individuals. So if you ever try to be a participant in a study for PET or for fMRI, those kind of research in neuroimaging opportunities, sometimes people get really frustrated because they're like, wait a second, why are they only recruiting right-handed individuals? Why is that a requirement to participate? And the reason why is because depending on your handedness, that actually might affect where language is housed in your skull. So if you are a left-handed individual, there is a 50% chance likelihood that language is actually going to be in your right hemisphere instead of your left hemisphere. So that is one of the reasons why. And so the reason why they try to do just people with right hands or right-handed individuals is to reduce the amount of variability in the brain activation, right? So like if you were to scan like two people, one right-handed, one left-handed, and you might get like no interesting activation whatsoever for a task that's looking at language because they're canceling each other out. You see what I mean? All right, and if you're thinking like, well, wait a second, shouldn't that just mean that maybe we have an equal amount of left-handed individuals as right-handed individuals? I agree with you. That would be a great idea in a perfect world. However, there are many fewer left-handed individuals in our society, which would make recruitment even harder, and it's already really hard to get people to participate in research as it is. Bilingual speakers also might not have language in these same hemispheres. So, for example, my native language, English, is predominant. That is going to be in my left hemisphere. after I got older, I started picking up a little bit of Spanish and a little bit of French. Those languages are not going to be in my left hemisphere. Those are going to be more bilateral in nature, which means that they're more evenly spread across both hemispheres. So you have to be careful, because if you're talking about where language is in the brain, it depends. It depends on what language we're talking about and also the individual, because not every single person is going to have it over in the left hemisphere. All right, let's talk a little bit about linguistics now. And actually, I will mention, because I brought it up in the very first video I made for this course, about the question about whether or not people who are bilingual, what do they think in? And I thought this, and I maybe even brought this story up, but the reason why I like bringing that up is because I can see the people in class that are bilingual. Usually they'll like smile to themselves because they know the answer. They know that it's usually not clear cut, that you're thinking only in English or you're thinking only in French or Spanish or whatever. That it's usually kind of a combination, or it might be one and then it changes the others. Usually, like for example, if you have somebody who works at work, they speak English, and at home they speak a different language. Usually if they are thinking about work, they are thinking in English, and if they're thinking about home, they are thinking in their native language. So it's really context dependent, which is really kind of fascinating. All right, let's talk about linguistics now. So you may remember from chapter 1 that a big part of the rise of cognitive psychology was questions about language. And specifically, it was about behaviorism and its inability to satisfactorily to the public account for how people learn language. And this was such a hot button issue because people, specifically Noam Chomsky, at the time were, and I'll write that name down because it's an unusual name, and I'm not sure that the subtitles are going to capture that. But Noam Chomsky would point out, because he was a linguist, that every single culture has language. And they all have spoken language, by the way, too. Except for people who are non-hearing, right? Then they have sign language. Same thing, it's a language. But that every society has language, and that every society has specific rules that govern those languages, and that this did not square very well with behaviorists' explanation for how language came to be. Because for them, language comes to be because of classical conditioning, operant conditioning, because of consequences of engaging in that behavior and things like that. And you can imagine, like, whenever you are learning to speak, is that because you're like hoping to get rewards, you're hoping to get allowance money or whatever? People didn't really find that to be a satisfactory answer. So Noam Chomsky came out here and was, talking about how, look, every language has a couple of things to it. They all have syntax, they all have semantics, they all have phonology. And so it would be so coincidental and unlikely to the point of being impossible to assume that all of these cultures that have never come into contact have all learned languages spontaneously away from each other that all have the same kind of linguistic structure to it. Noam Chomsky and kind of people today now see that as evidence that there's something about the human brain that its structure lends itself to language. And so you can say that as that we are biologically prepared to speak, to use some kind of language. That is the thing about our species. That my dog over there, Fozzie, you never see him move because he sleeps the entire time I'm recording, but he was biologically prepared to bark whenever something exciting happens, right? We are biologically prepared to learn to speak, to communicate socially. Can I be more specific than that? No, because I'm not a linguist. But that is essentially his argument. All right. So, and you can kind of see here that whenever we're talking about linguistics, that there are multiple layers of this. The 6 different layers that are often talked about in linguistics and communications. The ones that we're really going to be focusing on in this class, we're going to be talking about semantics. We're going to be talking about syntax. And then we're going to kind of lump in together phonology and morphology. So that means that we're going to be talking about phonemes, We're going to be talking about morphemes, which is another way of saying words. We're going to be talking about how those fit together to create phrases, and then at the broader level, talking about what those sentences actually mean. Now, if we wanted to keep zooming out, we could, and we could talk about pragmatics, but that's usually a little bit, that's beyond the scope of our class. Psycholinguistics is a huge field in psychology, not just in cognitive psychology. For example, there's a university in New York. When I was looking for jobs at the time, and so this was a long time ago, when I was looking for jobs, I was looking at that specific department and noticed that they were very clear to be like, hey, our entire staff is psycholinguistics. That's all we want is psycholinguistics. So not only could you have a course just for psycholinguistics, you can have an entire staff of psychologists in your department that's all they study is psycholinguistics. Luckily here at Westfield, we have a really awesome mix of like some social folks, some behavioral folks, some cognitive folks, some developmental folks, and so on. But it's not always that way. Here's an example of what we're talking about when we talk about looking at it from phonemes, moving on to morphemes and words and phrases. So if we were to say something like this sentence right here, the umpires talk to the players, we can break this down. And in fact, we need to break this down when we're talking about how we acquire language. So we are breaking this sentence down into phrases now, where we have one phrase that is the umpires and one phrase that is talk to the players. And then we can break that up even more now. So we're breaking this phrase up now into words. The umpires talked to the players. Okay, cool. Now we can break this up even more into morphemes. And morphemes are going to be like a unit of meaning. That's a way to think about it. So it almost looks just like words, where you see like the, for example. But let's take a look at umpire, where umpire is now split up, where we have umpire, but then we also have the S. The S is a unit of meaning in English. That means it is plural. That means that there is more than one umpire. Just like when we look at talk, right? So talked is past tense, so we have talk, which means to express yourself verbally, to communicate. But then we also have ED, which is meaningful. That is a unit of meaning as well. It is a morpheme in and of itself. It means it's past tense, which means that when it's tacked onto this other word, that it changes the meaning of that word slightly. It means that this happened in the past. So on and so forth. You can see how that plays out as we break down those words. And then you can break down those morphemes into specific phonemes. So how to pronounce each of these specific words. Kind of interesting too to see, like, for example, the and the pronounced differently depending on when it is used. The versus the. Man, English is confusing. We're going to talk about this next piece a little bit later as well, but I wanted to bring it up here to talk about speech segmentation. So if we're looking at this right here, the umpires talk to the players. If you were to say that to somebody who doesn't have a good grasp on English, they might ask you to slow down a little bit. And just like whenever you're learning another language, chances are you have to ask people to slow down a little bit. That's because if you don't know the language super well, you have a hard time kind of parsing out what the individual words are. We do that almost automatically when we know the language intimately, when we're fluent in it. And that's called speech segmentation, which is whenever you're taking a really long stream of speech and you're slicing it up to look at the individual kind of phonemes that make it up. So, for example, that book weighed about 6 pounds. Whenever I said that, there was maybe one pause, maybe a tiny pause right here. But if I was to look at that waveform, it would just look like one long wave. And that is not how our brains understand that, right? Our brains understand this as that book weighed about 6 pounds. So we are able to break it up because we are familiar with that language. And this is an example of top-down processing, that because of our understanding and our knowledge of that language, we are able to insert these imaginary pauses between these words to help us understand what it is that we are hearing. So if you've ever felt like you're watching another language and it feels like one long stream of speech, one long word, it's just because you don't know where those little invisible pauses are. And you won't really know them until you become familiar with the language itself. This is something that if you took sensation perception with me in a previous semester, we talked about this as the problem of co-articulation, and we talk about it in much more detail there. So if you want to know more about this stuff, you got to sign up for Psych 359, my friend, or find that video that I posted online of it. Okay, let's talk about phrase structures. Actually, I will talk about this. I didn't really talk about this that much in the textbook, but I'll mention it here because I think that is interesting. That generally when we are talking, because I'm talking about pausing during speech, that whenever we are talking, that we, between sentences, generally do not insert between words will not fit in individual pauses delineating those individual words. But we do pause to create units of meaning. So whenever we are talking, for example, actually, and I'm doing this as I talk, but for example, if I was going to, let me just read this right here. In other words, we can still rethink the meaning of the phrase only when we are actively focused on it. So you can see that I kind of paused a little bit here. So like just naturally, I paused after in other words, because there's a comma there. And I kind of added a little emphasis around rethink here. And then I paused again at the end of that sentence. So generally speaking, whenever we are processing language, when we are hearing it and comprehending it, our brains work this way too, that we need a little pause there in order to consolidate those specific thoughts into some kind of meaning. So when we are reading a sentence, we are going to try to extract as much information as we can for each word, and then whenever we experience a pause in that sentence, we use that as a quick chance to wrap up our thoughts and solidify any kind of ambiguities before we move on. So, for example, if you were to see this sentence right here, because of its lasting construction as well as its motor's power, the boat was of high quality. So there are three phrases here. Because of its lasting construction, as well as its motor's power, the boat is of high quality. So why do we pause here? So because of its lasting construction, that is a phrase in like by itself. It has its own meaning, but you can see that this meaning right here is ambiguous. It's unclear what it's referring to. Just like after as well as the motor's power, we also pause for a second because it's ambiguous. And then when we wrap it up, there is no pause right there at the end. So basically, whenever we are trying to interpret sentences, we are, or when we are expressing ourselves, I should say, when we are trying to express ourselves, we will insert those pauses because we need those pauses to comprehend things in a meaningful way. All right. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the difference between syntax and semantics now. So syntax is going to be looking at the grammar, the rules of the language, and semantics are looking at the meaning of the words. So we know that these things are related because when we're talking about language, it's a combination of these things. But are they independent from one another? That's kind of tricky to say. So, for example, we know that syntax can affect semantics. So, basically, the grammar can affect the meaning of things. And at least as an English speaker, you probably know this because, like, for example, sarcasm is kind of an example of this, but it also kind of depends on the context in which you're saying something. But, like, if you were to say, like, oh, I didn't realize that psychology was the study of the brain, something like that. And I retorted, oh yeah, it's real hard to figure that out, right? That's not technically syntax exclusively because there's some vocal manipulations going on there. But I'm being sarcastic and I am undercutting that person's sentiment, right? I am mocking that person. And that is an example of how, based on the way that I'm phrasing this information, can change what the semantics of that communication is. So they are related. They're not completely independent from one another. Let's take a look at this right here, these phrases. The boy the girl liked was sick. So think about that sentence, what it says. The boy the girl liked was sick. So who was sick here? The boy, right? All right, so what about that sentence versus the girl liked the boy that was sick? This one feels a little bit different, right? So the girl liked the boy that was sick. And so here, it kind of feels a little bit like the way these sentences are set up. This first one is a little bit harder to understand. And because of that, it actually increases the amount of processing we need to understand it. So Broca's area is more activated on this first sentence, which usually means that we remember it a little bit better. If you think about chapter 6, when we were talking about how much processing you have in your frontal lobe when you're encoding something and how that can predict how durable information is. Same thing that we have going on here. That the more work you put into processing something, generally the easier it's going to be. Well, the higher the chance it gets consolidated into long-term memory, I should say. So, so basically the way that these sentences are worded actually changes how well we remember that specific information. When we talk in terms of ambiguity, actually, I don't want to talk about this. I'm just going to skip over this for the sake of time, because we've been going on too long. Actually, I do want to mention this because it's kind of hilarious, that when we talk about this dynamic of syntax and semantics, that there are cultural differences to this as well. So when I was talking about sarcasm, some of you may not have picked up on that because sarcasm does not come naturally to you, and that's totally fine. And that's because it can be a cultural thing and it can be a context thing. And so, for example, whenever Americans come across an ambiguous sentence, Americans will rely on the syntax to try to understand what that is. So, Americans will typically try to look at the grammar to try to understand what was being communicated, but Italian speakers, on the other hand, rely a little bit more on the semantics. So I haven't seen any kind of specific studies, so if any of you are Italian or have any kind of Italian relatives, let me, and I don't mean like they've been living in America for 120 years, I mean like, kind of still live in Naples or whatever. How do they feel about sarcasm? Are they big on sarcasm, or do they have other ways of dealing with whatever we use sarcasm for? I don't know, because that they rely more on semantics might mean that they don't have that same kind of reaction to sarcasm that we might. All right, let's talk a little bit about how we acquire language now. So this is a tricky subject because it is really, really, really hard to measure the behavior of babies. And there's a lot of reasons for this. It's mostly because they get bored and they don't like to follow directions and they can't speak, right? And those three things working together means that it's really hard to get data from this population. So our understanding of this stuff can be a little bit limited because I can't ask a baby like, hey, how many words do you know? I can't ask them that, or I can, but they're not going to answer me in a meaningful way. And even if they could, I don't think they would understand what I was saying. They'd probably just babble at me, right? So that's all to say that we're going to be looking at some unusual testing methods to try to understand how we know that babies can speak English or understand a language. All right, so language acquisition technically starts before we are even born. So when we are in utero, the experiences of sound that an infant gets can change their language and what sounds are familiar to them. So I'm not going to say that being a newborn, if you are a newborn and you watch a lot of let's say that you're pregnant and you for whatever reason you can't get enough of Korean soap operas while you're resting, so you're watching a lot of that. That doesn't mean that your baby's going to come out bilingual, speaking English and Korean, but it might mean that under certain testing techniques, if we're looking at whether or not an infant can discriminate a familiar sound versus an unfamiliar sound. That's as basic as we're talking about. Does this baby, is this familiar or is this unfamiliar? That a baby that is exposed to a lot of Korean soap operas, for example, might classify some of those Korean phrases as familiar because they were exposed to it. And so how they actually test that is usually, well, we're going to get into it in just a little bit, but it usually involves how long an infant looks at a speaker. So an infant that is around, let's say you have two complete strangers, one that is talking in an unfamiliar speech and one that is talking in a familiar speech. An infant is going to look at the stranger that is talking in unfamiliar speech first and longer than one that is speaking familiar. And the reason for that is because babies are attracted to new things. They are what we call neophilic. So they like new things. You know this because you've had a baby. They love to be distracted by bright, colorful new things, right? It doesn't take long for them to be like, oh, this is old, I don't care about it. This is, somebody walks into a room, they're fascinated for 5 seconds, and they get bored and they turn around. And so, in situations like this, where they've tested the language acquisition of newborns, what they find is that if you have like two speakers, one that is speaking the native language of the mother and one that is speaking a foreign language that has never been exposed to the mother while she is pregnant, that those newborns will fixate, at least at first, on that unfamiliar language. They'll be like, what the hell is that person saying? They won't recognize it. Now, I do also want to say this is like not something that we're consciously aware of, right? Like that babies are not thinking that. They're not thinking like, oh, by George, I've never heard those sounds, as mellifluous as they might be from that tongue. They don't say that. They're just like, what the hell? That's new. That's new. That's basically it, right? But using that instinct, using that reaction can tell us a lot about what babies have learned and what they haven't learned about language as they get older. So speech generation is usually about one word as you're about 1 year old and about 2 words whenever you're 18 months old. And that's usually around the time that we start putting together words to create rudimentary phrases too. But there's some wiggle room in these mile markers, as you know. Probably not everybody had the same kind of experience. I already mentioned that for me, I didn't start speaking until I was 2.5 years. So that when I was 30 months old. Oh boy, my parents were probably worried. All right, because 2.5. All right, so talking a little bit more about speech segmentation. This brings us to what's called statistical learning. So statistical learning really does sound like we're learning about statistics. It sounds like you're learning about Psych 319, a class that you take in college. You're learning about means and medians and modes and standard deviation. But that is not what we mean here. Statistical learning, at least in psycholinguistics, is all about pattern recognition. And that actually, I think, is a better way to think about this, is that I'm just going to show you a study where these babies are engaging in pattern recognition. So the question here is, how likely is a sound to follow based on what you know so far? So for example, if I said, I started to say, what do you think the next phoneme out of my mouth is going to be? What is the next sound? Do you think it'll be FK? Probably not, right? That's not a word. That's not, or at least it's not an English word. The combination of those morphemes are not very likely. But what if the next one was an? An. That's not. Like me pronouncing it that way is not really an. That's not really an English word, but than is. Right? And so those morphemes, those phonemes are okay next to one another. That whenever I hear th is not unusual if an follows it, or n, or in, or ing, or anos, right? Like depending on when we sorry, one of those was almost a really unfortunate pronunciation. I'm not going to talk about it though. But basically, when we hear a sound, we know that there are certain sounds that are likely to follow that and some that are not likely to follow that. So that if you get an FK, it does not sound right. It sounds like an alien language when you hear it that way. And that is statistical learning, that you have learned that some sounds are going to follow others and not follow others. So we're learning about that pattern recognition. And this helps us kind of filter out what are the irrelevant cues here. So, for example, if you did hear the fk, for example, if you heard somebody say that, you would probably think that is not really a word, or at the very least that there was some part of the word here and then more of this word here that maybe you caught, like Fakasha. Trying to be careful here to not say any naughty words. Fakasha bread, right? Bath and fakasha. I don't know. But basically, that if you hear sounds that don't go together, you might assume that, well, they must be part of a different words altogether. So this helps us understand where one word ends and the next begins. And you've probably seen this before whenever you've dealt with speech recognition software, where you feel the need to slow down and enunciate so that you can make it very clear what sounds are going together. So this was first demonstrated in infants with Safran, Aslan, and Newport. I used to assign this article as one that our class would read because it's really short. It's only like 3 pages, but it's extremely interesting, and I don't know, students just weren't into it. I think that they felt like it was too short, and because of that it was a little bit too dense and jargon heavy, and they weren't able to extract meaningful information from it. So that's why I'm covering it here instead of assigning it as a research article for you to learn. So in this task, what they did is they had infants listen to an artificial language for about 2 minutes. Why do they listen to an artificial language? Because they didn't want to get like Korean, for example. We're assuming these were English researchers from the Carolinas, I believe. I don't remember if it was South or North Carolina. But they were, and this is, I don't know if her name rings a bell to anybody now. This is Jenny Safran. She was a little bit of a big deal after this. This helped launch her career to be extremely influential. But they used this artificial language because just in case, to make sure that maybe there wasn't anybody who had accidentally had on Korean soap operas or whatever, or Spanish telenovelas or whatever, that way they don't have that previous experience, because we know just a little bit of experience can be picked up when we test babies on that stuff. So they gave them this artificial language, and this artificial language did have certain syllable pairings that followed kind of a normal grammar. So that way, you're listening to 2 minutes of gibberish, but it's not completely random gibberish. So after this, they were tested on pairs of sounds, and the babies would get sounds like van. And this would be an example of something that follows for English, right? But they also got some pairs that didn't, which would be like Red Joe, or something like that. Where those, I guess those kind of, I take it back, those can kind of go together. I'm trying to think of some ones that don't. Rep. I just throw an F in there, and that can help. But like this, for example, is one that would break the artificial the pairings of English, at least, and would not go together. And so the question is, would infants pick up on this? Would they be able to listen to language for 2 minutes and then be able to tell, based on that artificial language, which syllables go together and which ones don't? And they were able to do that. They were able to detect which syllables were likely to follow others based on just as simple as those 2 minutes. Here is an example of the actual nonsense that they gave them. So they would give babies 2 minutes of this. Toki bu go pi la gi ko ba ti po lu toki bu go pi la ti po lu tu ko bi gu ki ko ba go pi la gi ko ba to ki bu go pi la ti po. All right, you get the idea. And that might just sound like total random nonsense, but you can see that there are specific words that reappear over and over and over again in this artificial language. And that is what these babies were picking up on. That whenever babies would get toe, that they would implicitly know that a syllable that's likely to follow would be ki, but would not be gi, for example. All right. Here's an example of how oftentimes I mentioned that when we have speech that it looks like one long word. And so if I were to say, like, my name is Dan Reisberg, who I stole this image from Dan Reisberg's textbook, which is why it says that. So I should have just put my name is Alex, and you would have never known. You wouldn't have put this into a generator. Do y'all hear my wife laughing so hard? What is she laughing at? I don't know what she could be laughing about so hard, because I'm in here, and I'm usually the only thing she laughs at. So, all right. So here, what we're looking at is my name is. That looks like one word, and then Dan Reisberg kind of split up. So speech segmentation comes from our understanding of the way that language works and what phonemes are likely to follow one another's and which are likely to be the end of a sentence or the end of a phrase. There is possibly a critical window on this, though, and you may have heard about this before, about how difficult it is to learn languages after a certain time of your life. And that's why sometimes it's called the critical window, sometimes it's called the critical period. It seems to be like this is a window between 2 years and 12 years old of age. So, if you don't learn a language in the first 12 years of your life, it can become extremely difficult to learn a language. Some people would even argue it might become impossible to learn a language. And this is difficult, is tough, because what circumstances would you see somebody who is 12 years old but hasn't learned a single language? I don't mean that they can't read. I mean they don't know any language. So this is tough because you can't ethically raise a child to not have any language just for the sake of science. So there is some evidence of what's called feral children. Sometimes you'll hear these people referred to as wolf children, people that were oftentimes raised outside of any kind of human interaction. I know it sounds like folklore or an urban legend or whatever, but people like this can exist, and it's usually not a happy story, obviously. It's usually very tragic. And so these individuals that don't have language, if they are beyond 12 years old, usually are unable to learn language at a fluent level. However, the counter evidence of this is that, like let's say you right now, if you want to learn a language, can you learn a secondary language? Yes, you can. It's hard, but you can. And usually adults are able to learn language pretty quickly if you give them a total immersion. So if I want to learn Portuguese, just drop me in the middle of Porto, right? Just drop me in the middle of, of Afuera. No, it's not the name of it. I'm trying to think of what the beach region is named. But basically, if you were dropped right in the middle of a Portuguese-speaking community and you were not allowed to look back at, English emails or English, TV shows or whatever, you were totally immersed in it, you would pick up that language pretty quickly, much faster than you would think that you would. So there is some evidence that at least learning a secondary language, that there isn't any kind of time limit on that. But at least for learning any language, there might be. So I do want to show this video right here. This is a video that is a little bit tough to watch because, one, it's very old. It's from a very old documentary, and it is about and more saliently, it is about a young girl that was imprisoned and isolated for the first, 14 years of her life. You may know this person's name because she was a big deal at the time. She was on all the news. Her name is Jeannie Wiley, and essentially her father imprisoned her in like this closet space, and she was rescued, and people tried to assimilate her into society to see what she could and couldn't learn. Would she be able to quote unquote be back, be assimilated into quote unquote normal society. That's what this video looks at. So let's take a quick look at Jeannie Wiley. I wanted to give you a heads up about all that stuff though, because it can be a little bit tough to hear about.
Amazing progress. As the experts looked on, they realized that she might be the answer to the question that had troubled science for so long.
So we seized this wonderful opportunity that she provided us in as loving a way as we could, but using it to finally get our chance to address head-on specific hypotheses and notions about human language and the human mind.
These hypotheses were based on the latest ideas about how children's brains developed. According to the theory, young children could only learn certain things at certain times, called critical periods. Language was one of these critical periods, and according to the theory, Jeannie, who was now a teenager, had missed her chance forever. But incredibly, Jeannie seemed to be proving the theory wrong. As this footage shows, Jeannie was blossoming. Not only was she delighted by the world around her, but she was learning the words for the new things she was seeing.
She was extremely interested in everything around her. She wanted to know the word for everything around her. She wanted to engage people all around her. She was not mentally deficient. Her lights were on, and everyone who worked with her, from teachers to therapists to me, knew that she was not retarded. It was clear as day. And as she began to learn more and more words, hundreds of words, much more rapidly than I ever imagined, and stringing them together, I began to think maybe I will be wrong. Maybe she will be the one that will prove that this hypothesis is incorrect.
But Jeannie could not escape the effects of her past so easily. She was still haunted by her traumatic upbringing, trapped by the memories of the awful fate she had suffered. And linguistically, she had stopped making progress.
She learned tons of words. She has an enormous vocabulary. But language is not words. Language is grammar. Language is sentences. How do you make a sentence? What can be a sentence?
All right. Okay. So, as I mentioned, that was Jeannie Wiley, and you can find there's lots and lots of documentaries you can find about her if you want to learn more about the stuff on YouTube. I will say, usually when I talk about this in the classroom, students will ask, what happened to Jeannie Wiley in the long term. So she, was rescued from her circumstances. Can you imagine, there was a clip of her, riding on a horse-drawn carriage. Can you imagine, being 14 and not even knowing that, horses exist, to within a couple of months, riding behind a horse? I'd be like, what the hell is this thing that's gigantic and hairy, right? But anyways, she was able to learn vocabulary. She just was not able to put those words together in a syntactical structure that would be familiar as a language. So that is further evidence of this idea of some kind of critical window, that if this window passes for our neurological development, that we can't fully grasp syntax. Kind of sad, it's kind of pessimistic to think about, but that is just kind of how it is, I guess. But this lends more credence to Noam Chomsky's idea that there's something about the brain specifically and the way that it's wired that encourages speech, because that's what that critical window is. There's something about this critical window that is specific to our brains that if we can, that allows us to learn language. And after that time, it seems to kind of either shut off or be inaccessible to create that hierarchical kind of structure of language as we know it. All right, anyways, let's move on. Let's talk about thought and language. So we got two more big sections here, one on thought and one in language, and then one on non-human language. So let's take a quick look at thought and language here. So does thought influence language, or does language influence thought? So think about that for a second. Do you think that the thoughts you have changes the way that you speak, or do you think that the way that you speak changes the way that you think? this is kind of an interesting thing, especially like if you ever try to like if you ever read like a bunch of like really old books, for example, you'll notice that like some of those old phrases will start like creeping into your language, right? And so is that an example of this, where like thought is influencing language? So, or are they completely independent from one another? That's what this section is going to look at. So in order to do that, we're going to be talking about what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the notion that language and thought are not the same thing, but that they are related, that they do seem to influence each other. So language influences the way that we think, according to this hypothesis, and the evidence for this comes from other cultures that researchers have come across. And usually these are cultures that are usually very small and oftentimes quite isolated from globalization. We'll look at a couple of examples of that. But what would happen is we would notice that, and I say we, but I just mean psychologists, would notice that some different languages would have maybe different kinds of patterns of thought in that language. Here is an example of what we mean. So here is an English phrase and so this is like a really old example. This is like when this stuff was first published. So you can clean with a ramrod. So like if you were going to clean your gun, you would use a ramrod to do that. And so you could say, I clean it with the ramrod. And when we say that, what comes to mind when we say the word clean? Right? At least most of us think about like clean as in like it is now fresh, right? It now no longer has any debris on it. Whenever I say with, what does that mean to you? When I think with, if I were to clean something with, then that probably means that I have something, right? That I'm able to hold something and do something with it. And when I say ramrod, what comes to mind is probably nothing for you unless you have used a musket recently. You think about those long poles that you can jam down gunpowder and stuff like that in. So that is what comes to mind when we hear the phrase, I clean the gun with the ramrod, or I clean it with the ramrod. If we were to directly translate that in a different language, let's say Shawnee, for example, so we're looking at indigenous American language, that a direct translation of that would be clean. The word for that is this. And the connotations of that is not exactly fresh, but merely that it is dry, that it is not kind of dirty or wet. When the word with translates essentially into inside something. And whenever we say ramrod, that is usually indicated by the actual motion of the tool in conjunction with the sound of an H. So these are really different kind of images that come to our mind when we're talking about what each of these individual words mean. And according to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that because we have different languages, that changes what we think about, and what we think about changes how we behave. So how do we test this? The way that it's generally tested is that you're going to have isolated folks around the world, people that live on small island communities that don't have the internet, for example. And if their language is very different, people will look for ways in which their perception might be different. And usually this is like asking people about colors, is asking them about shapes, is asking them about quantities of things. So the example one of the most famous examples of this is the Dani tribe in New Guinea. So New Guinea being in Southeast Asia, around Indonesia. And in some of those communities, their language, they just kind of group together dark colors and bright colors. So they have a word for these darker cold colors that they call mili, and they have a word for brighter warm colors they call mola. And that is very different than at least in English, right? So in English, we will talk about like blue and green, right? And that would probably both be called mili, to this group. And then if I were to talk about orange and pink, that those would probably be called mola in this group instead of orange and pink. This is not to say, also, that that means one language is better than the other. Not at all. Because if that were the case, then English would be the best language in the world because it has way more vocabulary than any other language. And I think we all kind of agree that English can be very specific, but is obnoxious with how many synonyms it has and how many rules it has that are, so dependent on the context. So I'm not trying to say that any language is better than the other one. So I want to really quickly show you an example. Oh boy. Show you an example of what a test like this might look like. So I'm going to show you this color right here. So that color, if I were to take that away and show you this color, to me, those colors, if I had a word for one, I'm going to call this one teal, probably. I'm going to call this one olive, right? This one I'm going to call orange. Purple. I don't know, lime. I don't know, seafoam, maybe. But the point is that if I were to take, let's say, these colors right here, I can tell them apart. I can look at them visually and say, yes, this one right here is brighter than this one right here. But let's say if I didn't have words to distinguish them, I know they're green. Maybe this one's a little more yellowish than this one, but I'm having a hard time kind of exactly saying what the different colors are. I can use my eyes and see that they are different, but I don't really have good language to say this is green and then this one is yellow, for example. And this is the same thing for the Dani tribe. So it's not that the Dani tribe can't tell the difference between these two because to them they're both mola, right? Because they're both kind of bright and warm, at least to me. But that they would just call them kind of the same way that I would say, yeah, they're both green. I'm not being wrong in English saying they're both green. I may be not being super precise, but that's because we generally do have a category for this kind of color, and we usually call it, I don't know, olive or mustardy, or I don't know if that's chartreuse or whatever, but all right, moving on. Moving back over to whorf. So that's how that kind of stuff is measured. So the result of that generally is that language can change the way you classify colors and the way that you perceive where one color ends and where the next one begins, but it doesn't mean that it totally changes the way that you perceive those colors. It doesn't mean that your eyes are any different. Here is an example of, I don't remember exactly which language this is right here. Sorry, let me pop out one more time to see, because I think I may have actually cropped this out. The Burinmo language. All right, so again, both of these groups of people, both of these societies could see this color and could see this color and know that it differs from this color right here and this color right here. However, depending on the specific, like for example, these colors right here are considered WAP, and they are different to this language than these colors right beneath it. And you can see that for me. All right, so for me, when I look at these four colors, to me they're all the same, right? They're all just light blue. But if I were to speak this language, that would be the same as saying like this is green and this is blue, right? Like that feels very extreme when you say it like that, because they have words to delineate those, and we don't, at least in English. All right, so that is evidence for this interaction between language and thought. And I should also say that, again, this doesn't mean that if you learn a different language that it changes the way that you perceive the world completely, but it does change the way that you group and categorize experiences in life. It does impact our memories. We talked about that with the Loftus article. We were talking about the car crash article. So we talked about how language can change how we remember different things, and we talked about that with eyewitness testimony as well. But anybody who's claiming that language can kind of alter your reality is probably full of shit. So neurolinguistic programming was very popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it turns out that it's not real. You know, people would say like, oh, if somebody looks to the up and to the left, it's because they are accessing the creative part of their brain. That's all bullshit. Don't believe that stuff. And people will charge you hundreds of dollars for classes on how to do that so you can become a better salesman. People, it's so funny that, like, we all know about hustle culture, right? And the idea behind hustle culture, right, is that, like, you want to try to make as much money as you can and screw everything else just because you want to get your money. And yet we listen to people who are big into hustle culture, like, assuming that, like, yeah, those people, they're trying to make money off of them, not me, though. This person's going to help me make money. They're not out to make money off of me. But that's what's going on with NLP. Hypnotherapy can be really hit or miss, and usually the explanations for why those things work have nothing to do with neurolinguistic programming or with language itself. It has more to do with suggestibility and different states of consciousness. I do have this fun video about the whorf hypothesis here, but I do not have time to talk about it, so check it out on your own time if you want to. He has a really cool example of a small community in, I think, Central America. I don't remember what country specifically, but that they communicate using talking about uphill versus downhill instead of talking about north, south, east, and west. All right. A quick little aside, though, because we've been talking about how language and thoughts are related. And I should also say that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, before we move on to this new idea, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, there's a strong version of it, which is that if you don't learn a language, you don't perceive anything. That's not true, obviously. Jeannie Wiley, for example, she didn't learn language, but she was able to perceive the world. So the strong whorf hypothesis is not true. If we can say that the whorf hypothesis is true to any degree, we're going to say that the weak whorf hypothesis is accurate, which is that it influences language, or language influences thought, but kind of at a almost surface level, not in any kind of deep, meaningful way, where it like changes the way that like now we perceive reds as purples and things like that. But there are some evidence that language and thought are not independent. One example of this is Williams syndrome. If you've never heard of Williams syndrome is a developmental disability where people will have significant disabilities in what they can learn. So they have issues with literacy, they have issues with critical thinking, with hierarchical thinking, but have no impact on their language, and are usually people with Williams syndrome are extremely charismatic. They're very social, they love being around people, and are good at having conversations, but their thoughts are often very, very disorganized. So the language looks perfect on the outside, and the thoughts are not as pristinely clear as the language. And if that shouldn't surprise you too much, right? Because we've seen other examples of that in our class already. When we were talking about expressive aphasia and fluent aphasia, where people were very clearly like trying to answer things, but had the inability to, whether that was because they couldn't get the words out, like we saw with Sarah Scott, or because the words that were coming out just were not making sense. This is all different from dyslexia. I couldn't find a good place to put dyslexia into the slideshow, but I thought that maybe as we're talking about like aphasia and people having issues trying to get words out, that maybe dyslexia is a good time to bring that up. Dyslexia is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects people's ability to kind of interact with written information, and that means both reading and spelling. And so it's not an issue with intelligence whatsoever. And I feel like that's one of the things that, like, I think your generation knows this, but probably your grandpa's generation didn't know it, right? Where, like, they thought that this person who had difficulty reading, they thought they were stupid or whatever. And today we know that that's not true. That we know that a lot of people, about 5 to 10% of people have dyslexia, which is a difficulty being able to process written information. So has nothing to do with the actual intelligence of somebody, or their motivation, or their willpower, or how much they want to be able to read. But it happens nonetheless, just from the way that those brains work. So usually that comes from difficulty mapping the sounds onto the letters, so kind of applying the phonemes onto the morphemes that we see. And that this is external, so people saying it, like reading aloud, but we also have what's called dyslexic thinking, which is that oftentimes those individuals, while they're reading to themselves, have the same kind of effects as if they're reading aloud, where they're usually like maybe swapping syllables and things like that. There are, for example, some fonts that people have created to try to help with people who are dyslexic, and this is one that's freely available called Open Dyslexic. And so you can see here that kind of the difference is that it has really kind of thick lower contours, and apparently that does help individuals who are dyslexic kind of map on the phonemes to the morphemes. All right, and then finally, we're now talking about whether or not language is specific to humans. So, and again, I know we're long on time, so I'm going to try to. I could talk about this all class, and I would love to. I'd love to spend 90 minutes talking about this. But there are three main categories in which humans and non-humans are different in terms of their ability for language. Now, I'm going to take a step back here for a second, because I've kind of hinted at through this video series and through our class that I think that non-humans are underrated in terms of their cognitive processing skills, and that a lot of cognitive psychology is very human-centric. It is very much like, let's look at how humans experience the world, and they don't really care all that much about what rats and pigeons and dogs do. But I think part of that is actually kind of a non-human prejudice. I know this sounds ridiculous, but I think it's a non-human prejudice that cognitive psychology has, because before cognitive psychology was behaviorism, and behaviorism was really, really interested in non-humans. It was really interested in pigeons and rats and mice specifically. And so I think that cognitive psychology tried to look specifically at humans as a way to kind of get away from that. So I think I don't totally agree with all this stuff, but I'm not going to insert myself too much more into this. I'm going to this is what cognitive psychology thinks. This is what cognitive psychology believes. All right, let me make sure I'm still recording, actually. Okay, we are. All right, so here are our three categories of ways that humans and non-humans are different. We got semanticity and arbitrariness of units. What does that mean? Basically, it means that for human language, so basically what I mean by semanticity is that about arbitrariness of units here, is that humans have the ability to take something like this. This is why I paused the video, actually, so I could get some water. Is that this is a bottle of water, right? Now, there's nothing, why is this called a bottle? I could probably find the Latin root of it, and it's probably something to do with that, but there's nothing inherently bottle about this bottle. So if I were to take this to an alien civilization, or if I were to take this to the Dani people of New Guinea, so they have no kind of connection to Latin language or to English or anything like that, and I said, what do you call this? It's probably going to be something totally different. It's probably not going to be the word bottle. It's almost certainly not going to be the word bottle, because that is arbitrary. There's nothing inherently bottle about this bottle. And of course, you can think of onomatopoeia, like the words like wham, or pow. Those are words that are not arbitrary, that they are specifically trying to replicate the sound they are about. But that is the exception in language, right? That for the most part, language is trying to create a sound that represents something physical in the abstract. All right, displacement in time and space. This is referring to the human ability to talk about things in the past and in the future and to talk about things that are happening right now and things that are happening really, really far away. So let's take a quick second to think about how this applies to animals, for example. So whenever my dog barks, is that a language? I don't think that it is. It's some kind of communication, right? But do you think that your dog has ever barked as a way to tell you about something in the past? Like my dog has never barked to remind me, like, oh, bro, the mailman was here at 3 p.m. and you missed it, right? My dog's not doing that. My dog is not communicating about things that happened in the past. My dog is only communicating about things that are happening right now or could happen right now. So he's barking at me when I'm trying to open up the dog food, right? Because the dog food's right here. So that's what we mean by this. There are examples of like animals that have danger alerts, like meerkats and monkeys, that they make these alerts, but these are generally going to be whenever it's in the presence of something. So not whenever it's like, oh, hey, warning, winter's coming in 6 months or whatever, you know. And then finally, we have discreteness and productivity. So this is referring to how human language is hierarchical. You can break it down into individual units, and you can rearrange those units to create so many different combinations of words and of sounds. So we can take all these different morphemes and rearrange them to come up with an infinite number of phrases and sentences to communicate what we are trying to do, and dogs don't really have that. Or other species, right? So like dogs don't have like a bark that has 3 different sounds in it and each sound means something kind of different. You might have where like there are certain kinds of communication styles where like you have a dog that has like an alert bark versus like a playful bark versus a get your attention bark versus an aggressive bark, right? But that's kind of it. You're not going to have where you have a bark that is sarcastic because it combines, you know, like multiple kinds of barks or whatever. Shout out to Nim Chimpsky. Nim Chimpsky is obviously a joke about Noam Chomsky, but very interesting story. I mentioned him at the very beginning of the video as an option. You know, you could check out this movie trailer of Project Nim, which is the name of the documentary about him. But basically, B.F. Skinner, thinking about chapter 1, right? B.F. Skinner, Noam Chomsky, they get into this argument. It turns out Noam Chomsky persuaded the public in the scientific community that behaviorism wasn't quite accounting for language. And for that reason, one of B.F. Skinner's final students, this guy named Herb Terrace, which actually sounds like a Fortnite map or something like that, Herb Terrace. But Herb Terrace, one of B.F. Skinner's final students, was basically like, you know what? You're wrong, Noam Chomsky, and I'm going to show you that you're wrong because I'm going to raise a chimp like a human to demonstrate that language will develop if you take a non-human and you raise them just like a human, basically. So he basically wanted to keep all those classical and operant conditioning, you know, all those contingencies the same like any other baby would. So this infant chimp, whenever it was adopted, it was, you know, had to dress up. It went to school. He had breakfast in the morning. You know, he, lived in a house. You know, had a bed and all this other stuff. But the project was considered a pretty huge failure for a number of reasons. He never really learned any kind of language. At the very best, he would say things like, he would use sign language, and I should say he was using sign language here. That Herb Terrace did not know sign language was a problem, which is one of the project mismanagement pieces. But Nim would say things like banana, nim, banana, banana, nim, banana, 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 nim. Now that's not really a sentence, right? Like that's not really like, if you were to speak to me that way, I would think you're having some kind of issue. I would be worried about your health if you were speaking to me that way. So that doesn't have any syntax, right? So Does it have a phoneme? Or sorry, does it have a morpheme? Yes. Sign language does have those morphemes. But it's not arranged in any kind of syntax and doesn't seem to show any kind of pragmatics or anything like that. So check that out. If you don't, it is heartbreaking. It is kind of tough in the final 30 minutes to hear what happened in Nimchimsky, but worth watching. Not just because it makes behaviorists look bad, but because it's a really important message about ethics, I think, and about, is this stuff worth it sometimes? All right, so for the most part, there hasn't been, like I mentioned, cognitive psychology doesn't like non-humans, and so anytime you see like a non-human that has some kind of evidence of language acquisition, a lot of cognitive psychologists will be like, well, this is not quite our standards for language. We saw the same thing with episodic memory, actually, but I'm not going to even get back into that. Let's talk about Kanzi. Kanzi actually passed away in March of 2025. He was around for a while. It was a really good run. This video is a classic, one of my favorites to show, because what you're going to see here is Kanzi interact with novel sentences. So one of the things that I was emphasizing about human language is that it is productive, right? That you can put together these morphemes into different kind of orders to create new sentences. And that's what you're going to see here. So Kanzi has not been trained with any of these phrases. He knows what each of these things are. He knows the vocabulary. And so the real question is whether or not Kanzi will be able to put these together following the language that we see here. A couple more things about Kanzi before I show you this video. This is Sue Savage Rumbaugh. She worked with Kanzi for decades. She was his handler, I guess, but there's awesome videos of them on YouTube, like going camping together. It is quite cute because they're kind of like an old elderly couple that like to get on each other's nerves every now and again. Really cool stuff. But he actually learned what he learned because he was an adopted bonobo. So he's a bonobo, not like a chimpanzee. He was an adopted bonobo that hung around his adopted mother while they tried to teach his adopted mother language using a touchscreen. And kind of through process of just kind of soaking it in, just kind of watching, that spontaneously Kanzi went up to the touchscreen and started answering questions, which blew everybody's mind and got everybody freaked out. So Kanzi was extremely smart and had a predilection towards language, or something that looked like language. So let's see what you think about this. And the reason why Sue is wearing this welder's mask is to prevent the clever Hans effect. If you've ever heard that before, the clever Hans effect is whenever you're working with non-humans, you want to make sure that non-humans are not using some other kind of social cue that you're using. So for example, if she asks Kanzi to pick up this knife, she doesn't want to look at the knife to cue him that that's where he should look at. So she's putting on this mask to make sure that that Kanzi doesn't see her smile, doesn't see her look a specific way, or any other kind of cue that might give it away.
Kanzi, could you cut the onions with your knife? Well, that's very good. Thank you. Could you put some soap? Kanzi, are you listening? Could you put some soap in the water? Could you listen again? Okay. Kanzi, could you pour a little Coke in the water? Could you pour some Coke in the water? Thank you. That's enough. You can. Okay. Kanzi, pour the Perrier water in the jelly. Thank you. That's good. That's good. You see the TV set? Could you take the TV outdoors? Could you carry the television outdoors, please? Thank you.
How cool is that, right? Very, very cool. So, let's see, what else do I want to mention here? That a lot of psychologists think that humans are unique in this regard. V.S. Ramachandran, for example. I love the guy, has some really groundbreaking stuff. If you've ever heard of phantom limb or synesthesia, good chance he had a good hand in researching that stuff. But he and others, including Steven Pinker, who I had a link attached to at the beginning of this video, they all believe that we have kind of special genetic properties that allow us to pick up languages in a way that animals don't. And so the argument is that NEM, like I talked about, and that kanzi, like you just saw, that what you saw there was a kind of learned behavioral chain. That's what they're doing. Is so it's really kind of like not that different than when you tell your dog to shake, and it picks up its paw and gives you its paw. Like, is that language? No. But is it communication? I think it's communicate. I think that means that your dog understands what you're trying to communicate, right? It doesn't mean that it understands what the word paw actually means, you know. Yeah, and I mentioned Coco. Coco was that gorilla who learned sign language that you see a lot of videos of as well. Coco, I think most psychologists will say that it wasn't real. You know, it was the same thing here, where it was kind of these complex behavioral chains. They looked very impressive, but wasn't quite what we mean by language. But I also want to keep in mind that, you know, if it seems like that the rules are really, really strict for being able to say, like, yes, this is language, that's kind of a behaviorist point of view, right? That, like, John Watson didn't really believe that we could study language in the head because we couldn't see language in the head. So who knows? It could be, you know, some time from now that people are studying non-humans and find some new way to do it, and we change our mind about those things. Actually, I'll mention one final thing before I end this video, that this notion that this is complex behavioral chains that do this, and not actually arbitrariness of units, a displacement of time and place, or discrete units. Those are the three things that separate human language from non-human communication. That on social media, you'll often see dogs who have learned to quote-unquote speak using buttons. And that stuff is so impressive. It is extremely cool, but it has the same problem. It all boils down, again, to that this is a really, really impressive complex behavioral chain. But being skeptical, it's not really evidence of language. All right, so that is where I want to end it. Thank you so much for hanging with me throughout all of this. We're going to be talking next chapter about decision making, which is also a really big field in psychology. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you later. Bye.